In the indie game dev space, there's a feeling that making shooters at this point is a bit cringe. I think a lot of people see it as an overdone genre, which is probably fair, but I just love a good shooter, and I feel like there's still a lot of room for the genre to grow, especially if we lose the shackles of having to balance for PvP. You really just can't beat that immersion of being inside your character, the satisfaction of unloading a heavy rifle and having the whole screen shake, watching that enemy in front of you explode or collapse into a ragdoll. For the last several months, we've been working on Steelpunk, our co-op strategy roguelike shooter, with the goal of just making a fun shooter and seeing what new elements we can bring to the genre. As with any dream idea spun up by young game devs, Steelpunk started as a much grander vision, a full MMO experience with PvP, a networked market, dynamic AWS-hosted game servers. I learned a lot by building those things, and we actually got shockingly far. But we realized narrowing down the design was not only far more realistic for something we wanted to release in the next decade, and without needing a publisher or investor taking a huge chunk of the revenue, but also made for a simply more fun and streamlined game. We're much more interested in making a deep and engaging combat system focused on PvE, as adding any kind of PvP throws a big wrench into that equation in all sorts of subtle and complicated ways, at least for now. What I'm specifically interested in is finding ways to make a shooter where actions are more deliberate. Something I loved about my latest playthrough of Elden Ring is how deliberate every action I took felt. It wasn't just a matter of pointing my weapon in the direction of the nearest enemy and spamming attacks, at least most of the time. I had to commit to really specific timed attacks, balance my stamina, and the extremely finite amount of healing the game gives you requires you to play nearly perfectly. I feel like the last 12 shooters, besides CSGO, I've played have all been pretty mindless, where I'm just thinking about putting my cursor on ahead as fast as possible while mostly staying behind cover. Which, to be clear, totally rocks, and I'm glad those games exist. But I really like the idea of finding that FromSoft pacing, or even fighting game pacing, in a shooter. I want to have to think about the series of actions I'm taking, in what order and what timing, and carefully balance resources. Simply unloading downrange shouldn't always be the best choice. It may or may not make sense or even be possible in this kind of game, but it feels like a unique road to go down, a justification at least for making yet another shooter in 2023. The nice part of this focus in direction is that we went pretty hard laying a robust foundation for a much larger game. So now we're left with a really extensible and mostly bug-free code base, which will give us more leverage for getting content out faster. In keeping with tightening down the game, we eliminated a lot of the unnecessary waiting we had when opening chests and doors and spawning enemies. I seriously don't know what I was thinking having these actions be timed. There's no good reason to make the player wait. We also changed the way enemies spawned. Previously we would spawn groups of enemies in waves over time. This was really great for overwhelming the player, but made clearing rooms take way too long. On top of that, it was difficult to manage what combination of enemies would be in a room at once. Often you would either clear each wave instantly, leaving you waiting around a ton, or clear them way too slowly, resulting in a heinous swarm of enemies building up that was terrible for balance and performance. These rooms could take upwards of 5 minutes, sometimes even longer if you were alone. Instead, we just spawn a group of enemies in the room to start with, and clearing a room just means killing all those enemies. This lets us be a lot more deliberate about which enemies we spawn in groups and the synergies between them. X healing drones with Y attacking drones, X ranged enemies with Y melee enemies, and so on. It's a lot easier to balance around those specific numbers. It also brings the time it takes to clear a room way down. As difficulty goes up, we can always just add more HP, more enemies, or add other mechanics to make this group of enemies more formidable. We're shooting for like a 1 to 2 minute experience for most rooms. And of course, we can always bring back the wave spawning for special interactions. Steam networking has been a big game changer for playtesting and quality of life for all of us. Previously, I was the only one who could really host multiplayer playtest sessions because the host needed to port forward for anyone to connect to their machine, and I was the only one who knew how to do that. This would obviously be an issue for future regular consumer players as well, since they would have to know how to port forward just to play with their friends. Now that we have Steam networking, we can bypass any port forwarding or even having to share IPs. It's kind of a dream come true. Players can just hit join game on their friends list from basically anywhere. I think the big early advantage we gained from building around Steam Gaining its networking, lobby, and social systems for free is well worth the potential cost of having to build a more complex system down the road to allow players on other services. Designing some kind of custom system prematurely seems a bit crazy, especially since we primarily target Steam for release anyway, so I don't mind pledging my fealty to Gaben. Since we're less than 10 developers, I've been able to switch to Jira instead of Trello, and my god, it is so nice. I can actually see the timeline, group tasks into epics, and even organize the dependency tree between tasks. It will take time before we master this, probably, but it's already way better than what I was doing before. There's been a ton of other engineering and design improvements over the last 2 weeks, but I like to get these devlogs out around every 2 weeks, so it's probably best for my sanity to keep them to the highlights. If you're interested in hearing more about what we're up to, or even participating in design decisions and playtesting, just join our Discord and follow us on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube, and TikTok.